Well, to keep everybody on time, why don't we start with the preliminaries? I'm sure others will continue to join as we go. Thank you for joining. Just so you understand, the presentation is going to be about an hour. We're happy to have you ask questions or give comments that we can see as the presentation goes. We will try to address those during the presentation. If not, of course, you're free to reach out to us later, or we can try to get back to you as well. This presentation is eligible for CLE, and at the very end, you will see a CLE code. The CLE materials for the webinar today were sent in an email reminder this morning, so check your inbox and make sure to fill them out and email them back to lgarrison@loeb. That address will be in the email, and that'll give you that CLE credit that, of course, you're probably looking for. So thank you all for joining today. We'll start off with introductions. Despite my co-panelists not putting me on the first slide here, I will introduce myself as Brian Heidelberger, chair of the advertising group here at Loeb. And I am joined today by a number of our attorneys, Kristen Klesh, among other things, a FDA compliance lawyer who helps to lead our health and wellness initiative. And Kristen is a partner out of our DC office. Also today, we have Caroline Hudson, a partner from our Chicago office. And again, among other things, is a food and beverage advertising lawyer. Caroline in particular helps companies manage advertising and marketing issues, including substantiating claims. We also today have Andy Hutchison, a partner out of our California office who specializes in class action defense, in particular as it relates to false advertising, consumer claims, food and beverages, and provides advice on California's Prop 65. This year, Andy, for one of our beverage clients in a false advertising class actions, obtained early dismissal from the dreaded plaintiff's class action attorney, Spencer Sheehan. So congrats to Andy on that. This webinar comes to you from our health and wellness practice here at Loeb, which we've kind of created to tailor to the unique needs of consumer product companies that are in the health and wellness industries, such as dietary supplements, functional foods, smart fitness equipment, AI apps, and wearable devices, as well as skin care products, and of course, traditional like food and beverage products. And we like to think that because we represent so many companies in this area, we really have a deep understanding of the regulatory landscape and the market trends, emerging technologies, who's doing what and who's getting in trouble for what, and what risks are being taken. And we like to put that to use to help clients innovate their products and ensure compliance with regulations and develop their own market strategies. So today we're going to talk in detail about bringing a food or beverage to market and the regulatory, the marketing, and the legal considerations from an FDA, from an advertising perspective, from a litigation perspective. And I think we're going to start off with Kristen.
Thanks, Brian. And we made it literally true that Brian needs no introduction with his successful advertising practice. We can go to the next slide. So brief agenda. The way that we've broken this down is into 3 phases. If you are launching a new food or beverage or supplement, what's really the life cycle of the product? Formulating your product, what do you need to know? Once you're ready to launch and you're out marketing the product, what should you be mindful of about what you can say, and substantiation considerations, and then, fingers crossed nothing goes awry, but how do you mitigate against the risk of class action litigation, which we're seeing sort of at the forefront of the food and beverage space in many ways, superseding risk from an FTC and FDA perspective. So Andy will wrap us up with that. Next slide. Okay, so while we have your attention at the early part of the presentation, I will go ahead and say that we're going to start with the more nitty-gritty regulatory compliance aspects that a lot of my practice focuses on. And then I promise if you get through this, we'll turn over to more, I think, fun and case examples of advertising issues that come up that Caroline will speak to. And then certainly always informative and interesting class action considerations for Andy. So bear with me, but I will try to make this fun. At least I think it is from an FDA sort of compliance perspective. So day one, you want to go to market and say, I want to get into the food and beverage industry. What is the very first thing I should know in formulating a food or a beverage? Are there any FDA requirements for the ingredients? Who else at play? Do I have to get some sort of authorization? And so for the purposes of this presentation, we'll largely focus on what I call conventional foods and what's also known by FDA as conventional foods. And these are your cereals, your snacks, when you go to the grocery store, and what are you generally buying to take home to your family? And we say conventional foods as compared to dietary supplements, but we'll certainly touch on that. And then some exemptions for foods that are not directly regulated by FDA in all respects. So foods grown on farms, or foods, served at restaurants or other food establishments. So this is really sort of your packaged food and beverage industry. So once you're in that wheelhouse, the answer is yes, there are key requirements that apply right off the bat, and those relate to your ingredients. Now, all ingredients in conventional foods, they don't have to go through an FDA approval process like a new drug, but they do need to meet FDA regulatory standards. And there's two standards you can choose from to meet for each ingredient. The first is what's called the generally recognized as safe or GRAS standard. The second is an ingredient can be an FDA approved food or color additive. So as you go through your ingredient list, you want to say, okay, this is GRAS as a food additive. That's sort of the process, and make sure you can adhere to a standard. So I'll speak a little bit to what those standards are. Next slide. GRAS. Now, this is the majority of your traditional food ingredients, chocolate in a chocolate bar, or oats, or rice hull extract, as you're going down your ingredient list, that they are generally recognized as safe by FDA. And there's 4 different options for compliance. So the first is FDA actually has a list of regulations, and I'll show you on the next slide what that looks like, that just says this ingredient is GRAS, and importantly, a food ingredient is GRAS for a particular intended use. So if something is GRAS for use in a baby formula, or GRAS for use in confectionery products, it doesn't mean it's necessarily GRAS for use in a dietary supplement or in a soda. So you have to make sure that if you're looking at a regulation, that it's GRAS for the same use as you want to use it for in your food. The second is you can actually put together a safety dossier and submit it to FDA through the GRAS notification process. And FDA has sort of a database that shows all of the notifications that have been filed. And once you submit it, you don't need to wait for authorization from FDA. But after 90 days, I believe, FDA will issue a response and say it has no questions, or it does have questions. So if you get a no questions, then you have the green light, you're good to go. Also, you can look at that database, and if you are marketing the same ingredient as what's been previously filed by another food manufacturer for a particular ingredient, you can rely on that. So look at the regulations and notifications. The third is called self-affirmed GRAS. And this may seem like sort of the easier way out, but it's not necessarily less rigorous. And the name sort of speaks for itself. You don't submit anything to FDA, but you have an expert panel put together of food toxicologists, food safety experts that go through a rigorous process of reviewing all of your safety data and provide a final opinion. And this can be done. It's certainly recognized. If you are an ingredient manufacturer that are trying to sell to a private label distributor, sometimes this isn't as great of a process because your customer may look to see that, no, you either have a GRAS notice or you've affirmed through a regulation, but it certainly is an option. And then the last option is GRAS through common use in food. Foods like milk or butter, if white sugar, that you're like, there's not a regulation. This just is a food. It's been a food since the beginning of time. So if there's common use in food in the US pre-1958, and you can point to that, and you're using the same ingredient and manufacturing it the same way, not using new nanotechnology or some other very different manufacturing process, you can also rely on that. So, again, chocolate, cocoa beans, and so forth. So I mentioned you have to be GRAS for particular intended use, you see right there. And another thing, if you are a brand that's working with a co-manufacturer, I highly recommend, because I've seen this play out so many ways, that right off the bat, you ask your manufacturer to provide, and we recommend this to all our clients, the GRAS rationale, or when we get to food additives, for each ingredient in your product. So often this can be overlooked, and you want to make sure you don't end up in a situation where you're using an unapproved food ingredient. Next slide. So real quick, this is just sort of to give you an example, of what it would look like in FDA's regulations where they list out food ingredients that are GRAS, so certain flavors. And you'll actually see, and we'll talk about this a little bit, that in fact, substances from food packaging are also can be included as being GRAS. So, food packaging is also regulated by FDA, and certain components can be sort of covered under GRAS statutes. Next slide. And then here is that FDA GRAS notification database. So if you're looking at pea protein, and we do this, routinely for our clients, they say, Kristen, will you review a food label? I'm going to look at it to make sure it's got all the elements, but I'm also going to check, wait, have I found a GRAS notification or food additive regulation that covers your ingredient? So you could click on pea protein and say, it'll outline, here's the manufacturing process, here's the dosage level, here's the intended use. It's used in confectionery products, it's used in pizza. And you can say, yes, this is just what we are using it for as well. And you'll see that FDA has no questions. Next slide. Okay, so we put GRAS, and that covers a lot of food ingredients. And then the second option is to say that you're an FDA-approved food or color additive. And food additives, they are substances typically added to food to have some sort of functional effect. They're a little bit different than your milk and cocoa ingredients. Sometimes they're more, complex words. You're like, I'm not really sure if that should be in my food, but hopefully it's okay. And the vast majority of them are safe. And so there's two types. So there's direct food additives, and those are your ingredients that have some sort of functional effect in the food. They're intended to be in there. So they're an anti-caking agent, they're an emulsifier, they're a color, they're a preservative, right? And all of those need to be approved through an FDA regulation. The second, and this is where the food packaging industry often gets swept up into FDA regulations, are what are called indirect food additives. And these are substances that are used that exist as part of the packaging or handling of food. They are not intended to be a food ingredient, but just by the normal course of food packaging, they can transfer into and migrate and affect the food. And so they are also regulated as food additives. And so, like I said, food additives have to adhere to a particular regulation. What if you have a novel food additive? What do? You found this new and great, anti-caking agent. Or I think if anyone's ever seen the National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation movie, he's like a chemist that's come up with a new cereal varnish that'll make food last a little bit longer. Well, you also have an option. You can submit to FDA a petition that says we would like to be a new food additive, a food additive petition, and FDA will review it and approve it, and then we'll issue a new regulation. So another option. And then finally, just again, a quick word, because I think Caroline's going to speak about this a little bit later in the food packaging context, is what about food packaging that is not intended to become part of food? It's like, the line that you're manufactured on, or the cereal box that we don't anticipate anything transferring to the food, or your ceramic mug. Those products are also regulated by FDA as food contact substances. So anything that comes into contact with food, so the lip of your thermos or the interior of your mug or your pizza box, has to adhere to particular FDA standards. And so they don't necessarily have to translate into the food like an indirect food additive, but they must still meet FDA requirements. So just something to be mindful of. Next slide. Okay, so now we know that we've got this basic standard for food ingredients. We see a lot of times clients coming to us with a question of, I have this powder, or I want to market something as a shake, or it's a small dosage size. Am I a supplement, or am I a conventional food? And what should help dictate how, which category should I be in? And one of the things to think about is conventional foods, like we said, your snacks, your cereals, sort of what you would find at most grocery store aisles, all have to meet the requirements I mentioned before of being GRAS or approved food additive ingredients. Dietary supplements have a little bit more flexibility. And the reason is this. For a dietary ingredient in a dietary supplement, what you might think of as sort of the active ingredient, if you look on a supplement facts panel, that does not have to adhere to a GRAS or food additive standard. Rather, the manufacturer just has to have, or the distributor, internal information that they believe demonstrates that the product is, that the ingredient is safe. So arguably a little bit more flexibility there. However, if you know that the dietary ingredient is what FDA calls new, meaning hasn't been marketed before October 1994, you need to file a safety notification with FDA. So I just want to sort of point that out. And sometimes it can dictate whether a company will try and shoehorn itself into the supplement category because their active ingredient just clearly doesn't satisfy a GRAS or food additive standard. Next slide. And then a secondary consideration. You can't just decide, oh, well, I don't have GRAS status but I really like this ingredient and too bad. My formulation's already set. I don't want to change it. I will just be a supplement. FDA has gotten wise to this, and this became a problem in the food industry a little bit, and said, no, wait a second. What type of product you are is determined by your intended use and what consumers expect your product to be. Do they think of it as a supplement, or do they think of it as a traditional food and beverage? And so FDA has issued a guidance that outlines factors that will help dictate whether you are allowed to be in the supplement versus the conventional food space. So as a couple of examples, and there's others, but we only have so much time. So claims that your product is a shake, or it's a meal, or it's a drink or beverage, put it into the conventional food category. So if you want to be a supplement, then I would avoid those terms and conversely include them if you clearly don't want to be. Additionally, food and beverages have different serving sizes. If something is offered as a 12-ounce drink or an 8-ounce juice, then you are not going to be considered a supplement, even if you have sort of, ingredients that may sort of have a functional effect aside from sort of a traditional conventional food or snack. And then, we won't get too much into this, but it's worth noting that the type of claims that can be available to dietary supplements as compared to conventional foods are different. Dietary supplements have a little bit more flexibility in making claims sort of how they have health benefits or what we call structure function effects. Conventional foods can do that too, but they have to be tied to sort of the effects of the nutrients or the taste or aroma. So a little bit more shoehorn or hamstrung there with respect to sort of really speaking about health benefits. But this is a fine line, and we face these questions all the time. So if you're on the bubble, it's certainly worth sort of seeking some advice from the FDA perspective. Next slide. Okay, real quickly, because I know this is post-lunch, I just want to make everybody aware that there is obviously more to food regulation than just sort of the labels and the ingredient list. And you want to, first and foremost, once you come up with a formulation of your product, make sure that it's being manufactured to FDA's quality requirements, which are set forth as what are called good manufacturing practices, GMP requirements. Most notably for this slide, I would just point out that there are separate GMP requirements for conventional foods, again, your snacks, your chips, your cereals, as compared to dietary supplements. Dietary supplements have more prescriptive manufacturing requirements. They're much more like drugs and are a little bit more rigorous, but FDA has worked over the last 10 years to make sure the conventional food requirements from a GMP perspective more stringent as well. And then if you're a food or beverage and manufacturer distributor, or even you're keeping your drop shipping from your facility as a private label distributor, for the most part, you need to register your facilities with FDA. There are, of course, exceptions to this, like farms and retail establishments, but I just don't want that to get overlooked. It's not simply the manufacturer, but if even private label distributors who are holding foods at their offices also would need to generally register. Next slide. Real quick here, just to make sure we cover all our bases. from a formulation and sort of go-to-market perspective. So you now, okay, your ingredients are safe. You've checked with your co-man. You meet FDA requirements for the formulation. You have a really good quality agreement with your co-manufacturer that says, yes, all of these are being produced to the proper GMP regulation. You have registered for your facility. You're almost good to go. The last sort of element before you get into really advertising and marketing your product is making sure you comply with FDA's labeling rules. And the FDA has very, very specific requirements for the food label, everything from the font size to how thick the hairline can be in the nutrition facts panel to the ordering of ingredients and so forth. But I want to just, and if we circulate these, just sort of give you a quick snapshot of what has to be on a food label. So you have first what's called your principal display panel. That's your front panel, like here, right? Puffed rice cereal. And that's going to have your statement of identity. What is the product? Besides your brand name, is this a cereal? Is this a meal replacement? Is this a shake powder? The generic name. And then your net quantity of contents that has to be stated on the front portion of the label, on the lower 1/3 of the box. And then on the side panels, we're called the information panels, is where you have 5 other requirements. So your nutrition or supplement facts panel, ingredient statement, including allergen information, your name and place of business of either the manufacturer or the distributor. And then finally, if your product is made abroad and imported, you are required to say made in X country or product of X country. And again, there's a whole host of additional sort of formatting requirements, exactly where, how big the type size needs to be, does it need to be bold, and so forth. But, we won't go into all of those details, but you can always ask us questions. Next slide. And then finally, before I turn over to Caroline and Andy, just a real quick note, because we have seen just an explosion in this area, is, okay, what about alcohol, right? So generally speaking, the Tax and Trade Bureau, TTB, regulates beverages, wine, hard spirits, and beer that have 0.5% or more alcohol by volume, ABV, at any time during their manufacture. However, their regulations must also comply with FDA's rules. You have to adhere in many ways to both. Where there's some divergence has to do with the labeling of the product. If you are a wine or a distilled spirit at 7% ABV or above, you're going to be regulated under TTB's labeling rules. If below, or if you're a beer or malt, if you're below 7% alcohol for wine or distilled spirit, or you're a beer or malt weighed without barley or hops, this is where we get some of the hard seltzers falling into, you're going to be regulated by FDA with respect to labeling. But either way, you have to register your facility with FDA. One thing, though, is TTB, unlike FDA, requires pre-market label review for products within its jurisdiction, so it's a little bit more stringent in that respect. And next slide. And as an adjacent agency that we deal with routinely is the USDA. So I put for you here just sort of a sense of this divide, this memorandum of understanding between what USDA will regulate and what the FDA will regulate. And for the most part, USDA is regulating your fresh poultry. FDA is regulating sort of processed meats, red meat. Similarly, if it's sort of coming straight out of the facility, raw red meat, that's going to be regulated by USDA. Processed products by FDA. One thing to note, because this comes up and could be most applicable for the certain elements of the packaged food industry, and it's just sort of a random bright line rule, is if you have a packaged food, like let's say a pepperoni pizza or a stew in a can that has meat in it, if it has 3% raw meat or more, or 2% cooked meat or more, it's regulated by USDA. If it's less than 2% cooked meat and less than 3% raw meat, it's going to be FDA regulated. So make sure you look out for your pizzas and stews and other products that have some meat in them. And then USDA regulates fresh fruits and vegetables, while FDA regulates processed fruits and vegetables. So I think that covers the bases, everything you would need to know, what regulations you need to comply with, and so you're prepared to bring your product to market. And now I'll turn it over to Caroline to make sure that you successfully market it and don't get in the crosshairs of the FTC or other regulators.
Thanks, Kristen. So I'm going to transition a little bit into the advertising side of things and talk about some claims you may want to make and work you can consider on the front end to support those and help manage some of the risks that might come along with them. So generally, I'm talking about things you want to say about how great your product is, what it can do, all the reasons why someone should want to buy it, all the selling points that set it apart from what's already out there, or what makes it new and different. So up until now, we've been talking about what goes in the product or what goes on the label and thinking about how you want to position it. But one of the things that's sometimes important to remind the marketing folks in particular is that claims can actually appear in many places. So on the label, sure, but also in other marketing collateral, in your TV spots, on displays, or on shelf talkers and social media content. And the same sorts of general principles apply to claims in all of these places. So we have to have substantiation or support for the statements before we go to market, and we're responsible for all the different reasonable but different ways in which people might interpret them that might not necessarily be what we initially meant. So that may mean thinking about things we say more holistically, both all the elements on the package, but also all the elements in our ads or in our ad campaign. And courts have, especially in the Ninth Circuit, made it a little bit of a moving target to figure out when and if we can point to other explanations or disclosures elsewhere, specifically on the back label, to clarify what we mean by claims on the front. So courts have both kind of given and taken away on this. In the Ninth Circuit in particular, their recent decisions have said, well, if the front label is ambiguous, then you can resolve the ambiguity by referring to the back label. But then that turns out just sort of prompts a fight about, well, what's ambiguous? So when does it make sense for consumers to have to look at the back? How do we know what's ambiguous? So in general, when we're trying to advise, sitting in the legal seat, working with the marketing folks, it's better if we can be more specific and clear in the claim itself and tailor it to what we can support or substantiate, rather than banking on our claim being ambiguous and getting support or clarification from elsewhere. And of course, we can't just fix otherwise misleading claims by pointing to a tiny disclaimer with an asterisk or other sort of hidden caveats. So on the next slide, we want to keep in mind and help our marketing and product teams keep in mind that there are actually lots of different sets of eyes on our advertising and labeling these days. And there are different sorts of consequences that follow from the extra scrutiny they might apply to our product. So sometimes we start by thinking about FDA, which makes sense, but FDA actually has a fairly specific focus and the consequences are somewhat different, maybe a warning letter or an inspection or something like that. The FTC is also taking a look at advertising generally and making sure claims are truthful and not misleading. But there are actually other folks we have to think about beyond just those two. State regulators are increasingly tasked with enforcing state level truth in labeling laws or other consumer protection laws. Our competitors are looking closely at our advertising and claims, and they may take something that they don't like to a self-regulatory body like the National Advertising Division. NAD may find a claim's not supported, and they can't make advertisers pay damages or issue penalties, but they can refer companies that aren't complying up to the FTC. And NAD's releases are public, so that could invite some scrutiny from the other sets of eyes that are also watching, like industry watchdogs, nonprofit groups, consumers, and plaintiffs' attorneys, all of whom are very active in this space, as I think most of us on this webinar are very well aware, and who are frequently filing lawsuits. So we're seeing these sort of nonprofit and citizen lawsuits in the green claims space in particular, which I'll talk about in a minute. And some of these consumer plaintiffs are really sort of stretching the bounds of who qualifies as reasonable as a consumer and what qualifies as a reasonable interpretation of a particular claim. And so we may have to, on the legal side, play devil's advocate with our marketing folks and product folks and sort of think a bit more on the extreme side sometimes to really sort of fully identify and really talk through the risks we're looking at with some statements. So on the next slide, we may also have to keep tabs on, somewhat less traditional places, social media content. Again, one place where claims can crop up that we may not have as strict of control as we have, say, with our labels, but FDA and the FTC regulate this content too, and some of the same eyes are watching the space as well. So that means our brand social accounts and channels, absolutely, but it also means the content and posts that we sponsor or pay influencers to create. It also means content that our brand account engages with by liking it or reposting it. Because when we do that, we are taking on the statements in there essentially as our own, at least the way regulators do things. And that can mean that we are maybe intentionally, but maybe more inadvertently adopting some of these statements as our own claims in our own advertising. Ultimately, we can't use third parties like influencers, members of the public, or experts to make claims that we as the brand can't make directly, either because we maybe can't support them or because they don't have the right disclosures. There's other issues in this area too, like making clear this is advertising and making sure this person is disclosing their material connection to our brand if there is one. But if we go to the next slide, there are some things we can do. I mean, for our own brand channels and accounts, we can set up, or we maybe already have a review process in place where legal is getting the chance to provide some input on the content that the brand is posting or engaging with. Maybe we have some do's and don'ts for the folks who are hands-on with our social media accounts. With influencers, we can, set ourselves up for success with a strong agreement that gives us the same kind of right to review and approve their content, and has some do's and don'ts for them. Ideally, some examples of what we probably can or likely can't approve, including the, disclosures that work for us and the ones that don't. And we have to do some monitoring just to make sure that we know what our influencers are actually posting, whether it's come through our review process or not, whether it's complying with all these things, and then take some action if it's not, like terminating them. So on the next slide, perfect. So we've talked about the different places that some of these claims can live, the different regulators and other folks who might be looking at them, a handful of process things. So now let's talk about what we're seeing in terms of recent trends for claims that are getting challenged. I'm going to start things off with some general trends that I think we're kind of seeing across the board and the rationale that we're seeing articulated for some of these challenges. And with that, some of the work we can put in on the front end to try to help mitigate some of those risks. And then Andy is going to take us on a deeper dive into some particular cases and some litigation strategies if we're already dealing with a claim. So we're still seeing litigation over the statements that have been, major targets for some time now. That's terms like natural or variations on natural, like naturally flavored. These are sort of where labeling litigation really got its start. And we've continued to see other challenges sort of spin off from there. So claims that something is real, like a particular ingredient or a source, challenges to other general ingredient related statements or claims about what's in the product or what's not in the product, and a lot of challenges over more sort of categorical statements that say things like 100% of a particular ingredient, or that describe something about the content as entirely or 100% made up of something specific. I think sometimes those claims often go alongside other allegations related to preservatives in the product or ingredients that have preservative-like properties. And then some challenges over things like that are allegedly contaminants of various kinds. And then another big category are environmental benefits of a product or something green or more environmentally friendly about the way it's made or what's in it. And that sometimes is specific claims about the content or the packaging, but it can also include more aspirational claims. So generally saying what the company is doing to try to be more thoughtful about the environment, that sort of thing. So if we go to the next slide, we'll tee up some of these issues and see what we can do to try to help on the front end. So we're still seeing challenges to statements around preservatives, again, primarily class action lawsuits. Plaintiffs are still arguing that statements like these are false and misleading because there are somehow still preservatives in the product. So even if they're there for some other reason, like for flavor, that's totally unrelated to the ingredients, preservative capabilities or properties. The initial focus for a lot of these was on citric acid and malic acid, but we're seeing the focus expand to other acids like ascorbic acid and sodium benzoate. For these, we're taking a more critical eye to the ingredient list, see what's in there, and I see, are there some of these ingredients that are going to wave a red flag at plaintiffs' attorneys and sort of invite them to send us a demand letter or file a claim? And if so, are claims about preservatives still worth it in that case to us from a product or a brand perspective? Any sort of 100% statements on a label can also, not always, but can often serve as a sort of lightning rod for attention, particularly if plaintiffs can come up with some sort of argument that it's somehow an overstatement, either because it overstates the benefit or it overstates the healthiness of the product or it overvalues the product relative to what's actually in there. So is there really, for example, 100% pure avocado oil in there, or are there also other oils? And I think we sort of have to include in here claims around whether the product includes heavy metals or PFAS or contaminants. And so for these, I think we have to sort of assess whether we're really at 100%. What does our documentation or our suppliers or our supply chain tell us about what's in here? Is there an adulteration or contaminant problem in our products or our ingredients industry generally? Can we do some testing on our product to see what else is in there? Ideally, maybe with some privilege attached to it. Or if not, is there something else we can say that's less categorical and maybe more qualified about the same concept or content? Yes, so I've also seen a particular focus on environmental and green claims. I think there's an increased focus across the board on these kind of statements from plaintiffs, sure, but also regulators and competitors. With green claims, there are some definitions and there are some defined terms for some of these. So we do sometimes need to start with the green guides from the FTC. They don't cover every claim you want to make, but they are a good first stop for the stuff on this slide, for general principles that apply to really any statements about environmental aspects of what you're selling, products, the packaging they're in, et cetera. They also don't just apply to consumer facing products or materials. They also apply in the B2B marketing context. And they have some really specific stuff about the content of your packaging. So whether it includes recycled content, whether it's non-toxic, they get really granular about, statements about how someone can reuse or dispose of your packaging. So things like recyclable, compostable, degradable. There's more general guidance about how to use seals and certificates and say things about your manufacturing process. I think one of the challenges with environmental claims in particular is that it's sometimes even more common for these claims to have more than one arguably reasonable interpretation. So because of that, green claims are sometimes even more likely maybe to need some qualification and context just to make sure they're precise to the support we have and the actual benefits aren't getting sort of overstated. There are environmental impacts across the life cycle of a product. It's not just at one stage, so we have to think more broadly. And so in general, I think the trend is that some of the claims and statements and things that might have worked in the past might not work as well today, not without some qualification and not without some support. I think with some of these broader statements, we may be able to do some work on the front end by putting some really specific definitions and disclosures around what we mean. There was a case recently involving a clothing retailer, so this is outside the food context, but they managed to get some greenwashing allegations dismissed. They said conscious choice, and the court found they actually qualified that labeling with some really specific statements about what they meant by that, that it has a specific percentage of sustainable materials, and then they explained what those materials are, and they talked about the difference in the impact that different materials can have. And So cases like that seem to show that there could be some scope for pushing forward with something more broad if you explain what you mean and you have some of these qualifications, but it might not always work. I mean, there's another retailer that's still dealing with a challenge over its clean products line, even though they did try to define that. So clean, a term that's really hard to pin down, so it's sort of hard to say, but there are maybe some circumstances in which having a definition and having some context may give us more of a fighting chance. So if we go to the next slide, we're still waiting on new guidance from the FTC and updates to the green guides. It's been over a decade since the last update. A lot of things have changed in just generally in the food and beverage space and consumer product space in the meantime. The FTC has initiated a review to make some updates. They went through a notice and comment period or a comment period, but we know this won't be a short process. The round of updates that they pushed out in 2012 took about 5 years from the initial notice to the finish. There's a lot of pressure on the FTC to actually address some things that they sort of refused to deal with back in 2012, like sustainable, and to issue guidance on claims that have become much more popular in the meantime, like carbon neutral, none of which are addressed in the guides today. So we don't have new green guides yet, but we're all staying tuned for more, even though it may take a while. And on this slide, while we wait on the FTC, states are taking the opportunity to put out their own regulations. So the green guides aren't a law, they're just the FTC's guidance. So states like California can pass their own laws that set really specific or particular requirements on green language and statements on products sold within the state. And in California, if you want to say anything that's in this list on the right on this slide, which includes a lot of the claims we've been talking about, or actually, if you want to use any term that's like these, then if we go to the next slide, you have to have written records that show everything in this list, among other things. So you have to be able to sort of produce with written records why it's true, other significant adverse impacts that the product might have, measures you're taking to reduce those impacts, any permit violations. You have to be willing to give the public these records, not just regulators, but really anyone who asks for them. Another challenge is, restrictions on things like using the chasing arrow symbol when there are some states that still require that when you put your resin identification code on your plastic packaging, that you put chasing arrows around it. So, it is a situation where I think we're seeing companies take a variety of approaches to try to deal with a patchwork at this point, when thinking about claims in this sort of more specific green space. Then the last thing from me on the next slide, aspirational claims. So these are also increasingly a target. These are, by this, I mean just things you want to say about your future plans or your goals. Those can be claims too. And they increasingly need their own support and their own substantiation. There are some risks from the class action side, again, for these. We unfortunately have an appellate court saying recently that even vague and ambiguous statements can be actionable as misrepresentations if there's something there for consumers to rely on or be misled by. Risks can come from NAD and self-initiated challenges by NAD itself, and then maybe some follow-up attention from regulators or from others. NAD also recently issued a decision over some really broad aspirational claims. The company set a specific goal, but with a target by a specific year, but they didn't actually have a plan formulated yet. They were still in the sort of exploratory stages. So NAD recommended discontinuing those claims. And then the New York AG filed its own follow-up lawsuit saying this company still isn't implementing a plan. And on top of that, their goal isn't feasible at all. So if it can't be done, don't say it. It's not that we can't make aspirational claims. NAD sort of went out of its way to say that we can. It seems like on the NAD and the regulatory side, they're just saying don't set specific targets with measurable outcomes when you don't have an established set of steps or a plan set up to get there, if you don't have a way to show your work. Even showing your work might not necessarily be enough to keep the consumer class actions away entirely, but if there's some concrete action happening to make the target achievable, then that can potentially help mitigate some of these risks on the front end. And so from here, I'm going to hand it over to Andy to talk a little bit more about some of the other strategies you can look at for these class action related risks, especially if you're already dealing with one of these kinds of challenges.
Great, thanks, Caroline. Yeah, so class actions, it's essentially private enforcement of these labeling requirements that we're seeing. Every state has some type of consumer fraud or unfair and deceptive trade practices act. And so we see, the general theory is that, consumers coming forward to sue because they're disappointed with their purchase, claiming they were misled about some material aspect of the product. We see plaintiffs' attorneys and certain firms focus on particular types of claims, make something sort of their specialty, at least for a period of time. And, it depends on whether their claims ultimately survive a motion to dismiss in court. Then they move on. And so trends come and go. It feels a lot like whack-a-mole because these attorneys are constantly adapting and bringing new claims about the products. Sometimes it's because of study, like the Consumer Reports studies the last couple of years that found lead and cadmium in certain chocolate products, or as Caroline mentioned earlier, the PFAS or green claims are really becoming popular. Other types of claims, they're the classic hits, the natural, ingredient contents, no preservatives. But there's a wide variety of claims out there that you have to kind of think about and make sure when you're putting together your labeling and your packaging and your other marketing, that you're not falling into an area where a plaintiff's attorney may come after you. Healthier quality claims, I'll discuss in a little bit where a healthy statement can be used to maybe support a false advertising claim related to heavy metals, but it can also be used to attack products that allegedly don't provide the health benefits that are advertised. A recent example is a lawsuit against the manufacturer of Poppy soda. It claims to be gut healthy due to its inclusion of prebiotic fibers. The plaintiffs are alleging that the amount of fiber is too low to provide gut health benefits, and to get enough fiber, you'd have to drink more than 4 cans. And so at that point, there's such a high sugar content in the soda, allegedly, that would offset most of, not all of those gut health benefits. So let's go to the next slide, Brian. So, one popular area mentioned, natural claims. There was a lawsuit against Polar for its seltzer. Natural, in general, these products are advertising themselves as natural, and they could be seen as deceptive because there's something in synthetic as an additive. Malic acid is really common. Same with citric acid, already mentioned. This particular product that was at issue, it had, it said in tiny font on the side there, you can't even really see it on this can. It said made with natural flavors. On the back, there was a nutrition facts panel that right above it said contains no juice, and the ingredients were just carbonated water and natural flavors. The plaintiff did concede in their lawsuit that there was a minimal amount of lemon in the seltzer, even though it wasn't expressly disclosed. And they alleged that Polar was using oils, extracts, and essences from lemons in the manufacturing process to create the lemon flavor. The court ended up rejecting the plaintiff's claims in this one, finding that just saying the word natural didn't guarantee a certain amount of lemon, and really took aim at the plaintiff for complaining that the lemon flavor didn't come from the right kind of lemon process. The court basically said, look, the lemon flavor comes from lemons, as you admit. So threw this one out, and it was a good result, but it's not always one you can get. Go to the next slide, please. So similarly, you have these real claims. Same sort of idea where the claim focuses on the existence of a synthetic additive that's not derived from real fruit. This spindrift suit was interesting. It involved, the sparkling water that you see here in the slide. It also involved their spiked sparkling water product. The plaintiff was complaining that the labeling was deceptive because it only identified sparkling water and real squeezed fruit on the front, but also contained citric acid. This one settled pretty quickly after the lawsuit was filed, so we didn't get to see how the court addressed the potential merits of this claim. A similar area of law to this is the made with claim. There was a big settlement recently involving Keurig Dr. Pepper, where they were unsuccessful in dismissing claims against it for its A&W root beer and cream sodas because it said made with aged vanilla on the front of the product label, but it was actually made with ethyl vanillin, which was an artificial vanilla flavoring. So after they lost the motion to dismiss, Keurig Dr. Pepper ended up agreeing to a pretty substantial class settlement in that one. Next slide, please. Another area that we've seen an uptick, because some claims have survived a motion to dismiss, is where it's origin-based branding. There's a variety of examples on this slide. The Texas Pete hot sauce was lucky. They were able to defeat the case against it in California because it disclosed on the back that it was made in North Carolina. That goes a little bit to what Caroline was mentioning, that sometimes if something might be ambiguous, that you can get lucky with essentially with relying on the back of the package to further clarify what the product involves. Other defendants haven't been as lucky. There was an Ole Mexican Foods product. It had a La Banderita burrito flour tortilla, and the court said that consumers were likely to believe that was made in Mexico, even though it was actually made in the US, because it included a Spanish phrase, for a taste of Mexico. It had the Mexican flag on the front and the center of the packaging. It had the brand name La Banderita, which means the flag in Spanish. It had a circular logo with the Mexican flag and the word authentic in it. And it had Spanish words or phrases on the packaging as well. So, and then if you go to the next slide, please, Brian. This is an ongoing lawsuit. Barilla Pasta has been tagged here in the Northern District of California. Again, it lost on a motion to dismiss, and then earlier this year, the court granted the motion for class certification against it. It has on its packaging there Italy's #1 brand of pasta. It's using the colors of the Italian flag on it. The court found that this phrase and packaging was deceptive because the pasta is not made in Italy and made from ingredients sourced in Italy. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with this case as it goes ultimately to a jury to see what a jury thinks about it. But it's kept Barilla in the lawsuit for now, and it looks to be an interesting one ultimately for these sort of origin-based brandings. But it makes you think about, okay, what do I want to put on the packaging? Maybe stay away from flag colors or something that ties to a distinct or specific geographic area if the product does not come from there or is not sourced from there. Next slide, please. Another area where I mentioned there's been an uptick is heavy metals. It's lead, cadmium, arsenic. These are typically naturally occurring. You sort of need to look at your own ingredients and what you're getting and seeing whether they're naturally occurring. But that's alone typically not going to be a defense if there's a high enough level found in the product. Because they're not disclosed and people aren't usually putting lead-free on their cereals or whatever, the plaintiff's bar has decided to focus on, okay, are there some sort of claims about the quality or the healthiness of the product? So here, the Lindt chocolate bars, the lawsuit's still ongoing. They have the word excellence here on the front. They also had other marketing about using the finest ingredients and it being a safe product. But the court said for a motion to dismiss, look, I have to take this as true, and the existence of these things are not safe. It's not the finest ingredients to have these metals in your products, and has let the case survive so far. That one's in New York involving lint. Cocoa Puffs, this is another lawsuit where it's touting, you can see on the front here, the existence and benefits of vitamins and calcium and whole grains. There's been success in California arguing that a disclosure is not needed because when you have, you only need to provide a disclosure if there's an unreasonable safety hazard or what they call the central function test, and it's where the presence of something impairs the central function of the product. And here, you can still eat the product, so that's a central function, so it's not impaired. And courts have been unwilling to find that the mere existence of trace amounts of these metals is an unreasonable safety hazard, but there's still some question as to whether it's generally just the existence can still support sort of a unsafe product claim. And then next thing, protein claims. This goes to a bit to what Kristen was talking about earlier about what's on your front and then also what's in your nutrition facts panel. There's been a firm really focused on grain products where there's some claim made about the existence of protein. If there's a protein claim made outside of the nutrition facts panel on the front, like here where there's a 5 grams circled in yellow there, then you have to put the daily value percentage in the back in the nutrition facts panel. If you don't, you're not in compliance technically with the FDA rules or the California rules that mirror the FDA's rules. And there's been recent Ninth Circuit law that's allowed the state law claims to survive, even though you're complying with the FDA rules and that it should be preempted. Then going here quickly to the relief available, you have, there's been a lot of challenges to plaintiffs having no injury, but it's generally been unsuccessful with the courts. So long as the plaintiff is alleging either they wouldn't have purchased the product at all, or they wouldn't have paid as much for the product if the challenge claim had not been on the product. So they paid more because they thought it was healthy. They paid more because they thought it was real or natural. So it's typically been enough to survive. But the interesting development that's happened is on the statutory damages front. New York in particular has 2 different false advertising and deceptive practices acts. One provides for a $50 per violation or unit sold penalty, and the other one is a $500 per violation or per unit sold. There was a case against Joint Juice here at Premier Nutrition in the Ninth Circuit. The jury awarded actual damages of $1.4 million based on 166,000 units sold. The plaintiff won his statutory damages under New York law of $91 million. The district court said that's too much. I'm only going to do the $50 per claim amount, dropped the award to $8.3 million. And in August, the Ninth Circuit vacated that and asked the court to take another look and evaluate whether the award was proportional to the legislature's goals in enacting those laws, and expressly said it was not opining one way or the other on whether that award was unreasonable or not. So we're still waiting to find out how that shakes out. Lastly, real quick with mitigation strategies, we're, do the things that we're recommending here, complying with regulations, and, think about whether settlement's worth it. You don't want to take the reputational harm of being dragged in the public and risk opening yourself up to copycat claims. So often those factors weigh against fighting it out in court. It's often difficult to win on a motion to dismiss, as I mentioned with some of these examples. Since we're at the hour, I'll turn over. Here's the CLE code for everyone. I guess we can see briefly if there are any questions.
The code is BEV123, just for those of you who aren't looking at the screen, that's BEV123. Thank you all for joining. We want to keep you on schedule, probably going to your next meeting. So thank you guys all for joining. We appreciate it. Obviously, if you have questions, feel free to reach out to any of the panelists. And as I mentioned, you can submit for your CLE as well. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.